Welcome to week 5, the 5th video blog for this course. Thank you very much for your discussion boards on regulation. That was really good. Thanks so much for that. Now we're entering kind of slightly different phase for the course now. So whereby the first part looked at risk perception, risk communication, that social license to operate aspects and those frameworks in the behavioural sciences. And then a second part looking at more traditional areas, say like expropriation, regulations, capital markets. Now for this week and into the first unit of next week, we'll turn our attention to look at how can we try and capture and analyse all the material together in order to improve the decision-making process for political risk analysts. So for this week we have the futures component, and then secondly the political risk modelling techniques. Now for the futures one, there's very different futures methods out there. What you're doing for this week is mainly looking at the aspirational futures approach from the Institute for Alternative Futures, where one place I work at. And no matter which kind of futures approach you take, one of the key things is this. We can just go forward as we are at the moment and to say, well, we're just going to go on the current trends. But it's also important to identify what are the emerging challenges might be, what are those new difficult scenarios that we may not necessarily have been thinking of, and to test the robustness of our approaches. Now the third aspect, so where we've got the expectable future trends and then the desperation aspects, the third one is a real powerful one. And that is what might a surprisingly successful strategy might look like. What might be something that we haven't necessarily considered but is particularly visionary in order to pull us through. And so Apple, for example, they've been employing scenario tools to help to dovetail into their technology development areas. More kind of help to inform rather than to guide and lead decision making, but there's sort of one area there. And then the countries also develop futures and scenarios to very much guide them. For example, Singapore and the UK have very much strong futures components to inform their long-term planning, say 15, 20, 25 years down the line. But a lot of it's kind of more nearer term, look at 5, 10 years down the line. And then one of the more famous ones is the Shell scenario planning entities, where in the early 70s, Shell had developed some scenarios that asked the question, what would they do in response to a major oil crisis? And they worked on some scenarios and what they might do. And then we had the oil crisis in the 70s with the OPEC group significantly limiting production. But Shell said, hang on a second, we have already run a scenario on this. And so they worked their way through that. And so they're far more prepared on that area. Now, just moving and changing gears to the political risk modelling element, the second theme area you'll be looking at for this week. And one thing I want to mention is that there are a couple of them which focus just principally on political risk, others which say we do country risk, of which political risk is just one sub-component to that. So the Economist Intelligence Unit, for example, is a good example there, whereby they kind of look at very much on the country risk areas, of which one of the areas they look at is on country risk. Indeed, you'll read in this week's readings on EIU, the Economist Intelligence Unit, that political risk makes up 22% of their overall composite indicators. And then we'll be sending you in an email as well something by Political Risk Services, which are principally political risk orientated. The other thing I'll send you in this email is the definitions of how the Lorraine Howe, who compiled these summaries of various different consulting companies, what they talk about political risk, as in the possibility that political decisions, political social events in the country will affect the business climate, that way investors will lose money or not make much money. Whereas country risk, they say, is on a much larger scale, encompasses political risk by incorporating economic and financial characteristics of a system along with political and social tools. So just keep that in mind. You've got the political risk area, and then you've also got the wide element of the country risk parts. And Berry is another good example where they look at various different areas, country and credit risk as well. In fact, when we look at credit rating agencies, they can form a significant part to try and understand the overall implications of the decisions by the policy communities. One such example is that the Standard & Poor credit rating agency recently stated that they're likely to downgrade the UK's credit rating because they are going to have a vote on whether the country should stay within the European Union or not. And because that political decision was taken to have that vote, they have decided to potentially downgrade the country's credit rating. Okay, so there's one of a series of things on that. The reason being the uncertainty for businesses, what's going to happen to them if the UK did pull out of the EU. As you go through the political risk modelling, you'll see there's various different elements when we build a model. There's quantitative and then there's more qualitative base. Just want to quickly show you something very much more on the qualitative area. One thing that I worked on a couple of years back at Jane's Information Group, or now IHS Jane's, country risk assessments. And this is principally qualitative in the way it's put together. So they would have a series of narratives put together, for example, some armed forces for India, and not many statistics, as opposed to, say, like Berry, for example, who have a lot of strong statistical material included in their content. There's not necessarily a right or wrong way how you put a political risk model together, but some models are better than others. But the key thing is, what is most appropriate for the end user? What is it the end user really wants to have that political risk model for? And that is the key thing. So if they can get a model which suits what they're looking to do, great. But even when you have loads of statistics in models, they can give you a false sense of security. Cue the 2008 financial crisis, where the subprime mortgage area, you had a lot of the investments bundled together with letter grades, which gave the impression of good, solid investments. And as we all know, that all kind of collapsed there. And even you may have some rating agencies that may you put the figures together and then say, right, they have the subject matter expert, the manager, who then tweaks those figures a little bit based on his own gut instinct, what he thinks is the most appropriate tool for that. So enjoy the next few readings, and I look forward to seeing you engaging more for this week's discussion board. And there's also a knowledge check at the end of this week as well. So I'll speak to you all soon for next week for the 6th video blog. Cheers.